In a quiet neighborhood, a lonely old man named Mr. Harris finds himself trapped in grief, his days marked by silence and memories of a lost family. But everything changes when a determined, kind-hearted boy named Daniel reaches out with simple acts of compassion that begin to chip away at the walls Mr. Harris built around his heart. As warmth and connection return, an unexpected discovery brings hope, but also raises new stakes. Can the bond between a boy and an elderly man help mend years of heartbreak? And when the past reemerges, will it heal old wounds or shatter everything they've rebuilt? The last hues of the sunset washed over the narrow, tired street, where cracked sidewalks led to houses that whispered forgotten stories. At the edge of this modest neighborhood, where paint peeled and roofs sagged, sat a house with its windows drawn like guarded eyes. Inside, Mr. Harris, an elderly man with skin weathered by time and eyes once sharp, now dulled, sat hunched over a cold cup of tea. His hands, marked with tremors, rested on a table cluttered with unopened mail and a photograph that glistened faintly in the dim light. A glimpse of a woman smiling with a bouquet of wildflowers, a moment trapped in amber. Across the street, 8-year-old Daniel Rivera darted through his yard, the rhythmic thud of his sneakers echoing his boundless energy. His curls bounced with each leap, and his laughter, pure and undeterred, was like the chime of hope piercing the silence. Daniel's family had moved in just a month ago, bringing with them a warmth that the neighborhood seemed to remember from long ago. Daniel had seen Mr. Harris before, a stooped figure with a gaze that looked beyond the present, always shifting between the world outside and memories within. Adults passed the old house with murmurs of sympathy or resignation, but Daniel saw something different. He noticed the way Mr. Harris's hand would linger on the doorframe, as if touching the wood could summon the ghost of someone long lost. One day, the boy's curiosity pushed him across the street. With a tentative knock, Daniel waited, his small fingers brushing against a pebble underfoot. A shuffle, then the door opened just wide enough to reveal a lined face and eyes shadowed by distrust. "Hello?" Daniel squeaked, offering a smile too bright for the gloom. "I'm Daniel. We live over there." Mr. Harris's brow tightened, his voice a raspy scrape. "Go on now. It's not a place for kids." But before the door could close, Daniel noticed the tired droop of Mr. Harris's frame. "Do you need any help, sir?" The words hung in the air, awkward but sincere. Mr. Harris's mouth opened, a refusal forming, but something caught, whether it was the earnest shine in Daniel's eyes or the aching hollowness he had long grown used to. He couldn't tell. "No, thank you," he finally muttered, the door clicking shut with finality. As Daniel stepped back, a chill crawled up his spine, not from the fall air but from the silence that seemed to follow him back to his yard. He didn't know then that this brief exchange would start to unthread years of solitude. From the window, Mr. Harris watched as the boy crossed the street. He felt a familiar sting, a reminder of a younger voice, long quieted, but he pushed the thought away, cradling the loneliness like an old, sharp friend. The next morning brought the muffled hum of cars, the distant bark of dogs, and the rustle of wind-tossed leaves. Mr. Harris woke to these familiar sounds, each one a tether to reality, grounding him as he sat up on the creaking bed. He stretched his aching joints, his breath escaping in a soft sigh. The photograph on his nightstand caught the first light of day, casting a warm glow on the smiling woman it held. Emily, her laughter frozen in a frame, her presence still lingering like a scent that refused to fade. Across the street, Daniel's morning burst into life with the clatter of breakfast dishes and his mother's voice, sweet but hurried, calling him to the table. He stuffed his last bite of toast and gulped down a glass of milk before rushing outside, his pockets filled with treasures, a marble, a piece of string, and a small folded note with, "Hello, Mr. Harris," scrawled in crayon. Daniel's mother, Elena Rivera, glanced out the window, catching sight of her son running toward the old man's house, her brows furrowed with concern. The neighbors had told her about Mr. Harris, how he once laughed loudly, how he had a family and was the first to volunteer to fix a roof or bring soup to the sick. Then how he suddenly retreated, his voice quieting until it was nothing more than a whisper, and finally, silence. But Daniel's nature was like sunshine seeking cracks. Before she could call him back, he was already at Mr. Harris's stoop, standing on tiptoes to reach the doorbell. The door opened wider this time, revealing Mr. Harris's puzzled expression. His brows formed a stern line, but his eyes softened with curiosity when he saw the boy holding out the note. The old man took it slowly, fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the rough crayon paper. "What's this?" His voice, though gruff, was less a bark and more a question that reached for an answer. "It's for you," Daniel beamed. "My mom says when someone is lonely, it's good to say hello. So, hello." He rocked on his heels, unaware of the strange, sharp joy that flickered in Mr. Harris's chest. There was no laughter, no sudden warmth, only a nod, a grumble of "thank you," and the note disappearing into the man's shirt pocket, but it was enough for Daniel. He skipped away, content with the seed he'd planted. The days continued in this quiet dance. Daniel would wave each morning as he sped off to school, and Mr. Harris would nod from his post by the window. On weekends, Daniel would find small reasons to knock, a lost ball, an extra cookie from his lunchbox. The boy's persistence chipped away at the walls Mr. Harris had built, walls made of missed opportunities and grief too stubborn to let go. One gray afternoon, the sound of hurried footsteps drew Daniel out of his yard. He watched as Mr. Harris struggled to lift a heavy bag of groceries, the old man's face etched with strain. Without thinking, Daniel sprinted across the street and reached out to help, his small hands gripping the bag alongside Mr. Harris's gnarled fingers. There was a moment when their eyes met, Daniel's bright and determined, Mr. Harris's surprised and glistening with an unshed tear. It was fleeting, a second that passed like a breath, but it left an unspoken promise between them. "You didn't have to do that," Mr. Harris whispered as they settled the bag onto the porch, his voice carrying a softness that had been lost for years. "I wanted to," Daniel replied simply, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Inside, Mr. Harris unpacked the groceries, his fingers brushing over the folded note still in his pocket. His heart, usually a heavy drum in his chest, felt lighter, as though the beat had softened. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. The seed Daniel planted began to take root, pushing through the cracks of Mr. Harris's carefully guarded heart, though neither of them knew how deeply it would soon grow. The sun peeked timidly through the clouds, casting streaks of gold over the quiet street. Daniel, bundled in his red jacket with its fraying cuffs, skipped down the front steps of his house. He had a purpose that day, an idea sparked from a story his teacher had shared about small acts of kindness changing lives. Clutching a small, crinkled paper bag filled with sugar cookies he helped bake, he made his way to Mr. Harris's porch. Before he could knock, the door opened, as if the house itself had anticipated his arrival. Mr. Harris stood there, a look of mild surprise softening his features. His eyes fell to the bag in Daniel's hands, and for a moment, the usual lines of weariness on his face seemed to loosen. "Cookies," Daniel said, lifting the bag higher. "I made them with my mom. I thought you might like some." Mr. Harris reached out, fingers hesitant as if they might brush away a memory, but he accepted the bag. "Thank you," he said, and this time, the gratitude in his voice didn't hide behind gruffness. He stepped aside, a silent invitation that Daniel accepted with wide eyes and a grin. The inside of Mr. Harris's home was a museum of shadows and quiet. Photographs of a life once full lined the walls, each frame a window to stories untold. Daniel's eyes caught on one picture, a young boy with the same dark curls as him, perched on a bike with a smile so big it seemed ready to leap out of the frame. Mr. Harris noticed the direction of Daniel's gaze and shifted, his back suddenly straighter, a protective wall rising behind his eyes. "That's Thomas," Mr. Harris said, voice barely above a whisper. "My son." Daniel's innocent question followed like a whisper on the wind. "Where is he now?" The room stiffened, the question like a stone dropped into still water. Mr. Harris's face closed, the light fading from his expression. "Gone," he said finally, the word weighted and final, like a door slamming shut. Daniel's small hand reached out, brushing Mr. Harris's thin wrist. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice carrying the sincerity of someone too young to know platitudes, only truths. Mr. Harris didn't pull away. Instead, his shoulders eased and he nodded, the smallest crack in his armored silence. As the weeks passed, Daniel's visits became more frequent. They would sit on Mr. Harris's porch, sharing stories. Daniel's were wild and full of laughter, while Mr. Harris's were careful, like old treasures that might break if held too tightly. Sometimes they would sit in silence, the shared space between them more comforting than any word. Mr. Harris started to wait for the sound of Daniel's footsteps, his mornings no longer punctuated by loneliness, but by the anticipation of an unexpected friend. One day, Daniel appeared with a wooden toy plane, its paint chipped but wings still sturdy. He held it up to Mr. Harris with a grin. "My dad and I fixed this," he said proudly. "I thought maybe you'd like to see it fly." Mr. Harris's mouth twitched, a smile trying to find its place. "I used to make those with Thomas," he said, voice steadier than before. They walked to the yard, where Daniel threw the plane into the air, its flight wobbly but determined. It soared and dipped, catching a breeze that sent it sweeping upward. Mr. Harris laughed, a sound that startled even him. It was rusty and raw, but real. Daniel's laughter joined his, mingling in the autumn air, a song of resilience and rediscovery. From the window, Elena Rivera watched her son and the old man. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, eyes misting as she realized that, against all odds, they had found something in each other, something whole in the fragments. That night, as Mr. Harris sat at his kitchen table, he unfolded the note Daniel had given him weeks before. The edges were crumpled, and the crayon had smudged, but the words were clear. "Hello, Mr. Harris." He traced the letters, a small smile softening the hard lines of his face. He placed it beside the photograph of Thomas, where it seemed to belong, bridging the past and present. What had begun as a boy's simple gesture had become a lifeline, pulling Mr. Harris from the depths of his silent grief, drawing him back into a world where hope could still bloom. Winter crept into the neighborhood, frosting windows and painting the trees with silver edges. The chill seeped into Mr. Harris's old bones, making his movements stiffer, slower. But this year, the cold didn't feel as biting as it once did. Each day, the warmth of Daniel's visits wrapped around him like an invisible quilt. One afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds, Daniel rushed over with an armful of papers and a grin that stretched ear to ear. "We're making Christmas cards at school," he exclaimed, placing the sheets on Mr. Harris's kitchen table. "I thought you could help me with one for my mom." Mr. Harris's brows lifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. His hands, still strong despite the years, reached for a red crayon. It felt strange, almost foolish, but as Daniel's eager eyes watched, he couldn't refuse. They worked side by side, the old man's careful strokes blending with Daniel's messy, joyful scrawls. A warmth bubbled in Mr. Harris's chest, unfamiliar yet comforting. As they finished, Daniel paused and glanced at Mr. Harris. "Did you and Thomas make cards too?" he asked, his tone gentle but curious. The question hung between them, delicate as the frost outside. Mr. Harris's fingers stilled, his eyes darkening with memories. The kitchen seemed to dim as he nodded, the edges of his mouth turning up in a wistful smile. "Every year," he said, his voice breaking like an old cord being plucked. "He'd use so much glitter, the whole house would sparkle." Daniel giggled, his laughter a light that swept through the room. "I like glitter too," he said, a gleam in his eyes. They shared a moment, silent but rich, as if they could see Thomas there, laughter echoing faintly from the corners. But just as the warmth settled, a sharp rap at the door interrupted. Mr. Harris's brow furrowed as he stood, joints creaking like an old ship. When he opened the door, a tall, broad man stood there, eyes cold and authoritative, a social worker. Mr. Harris's heart clenched, a wave of dread washing over him. "Mr. Harris, we've received concerns about your health and living conditions," the man said, clipboard in hand. "Given your age and recent reports, we need to discuss your welfare." Daniel, watching from the kitchen, felt a cold fear bloom in his chest. The man's voice, too formal and detached, turned the room icy. "But he's fine. I help him," Daniel blurted out, stepping forward. His voice trembled, brave but small. The social worker glanced at the boy, softening for a fraction of a second before turning back to Mr. Harris. "This isn't about taking anything from you, sir, but ensuring you have the care you need." Mr. Harris stood straighter, pride lifting his chin despite the tremor in his hands. "I'm managing," he said, though the weight of the truth pressed on him like a heavy coat. The words felt hollow, more of a plea than a statement. The social worker sighed, noting something down. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Harris. Until then, please consider finding someone to stay with you." The door clicked shut, and a silence thicker than snow settled. Daniel's eyes brimmed with worry. "They can't take you away, right?" Mr. Harris looked at the boy, his heart aching at the fear he saw there. He patted Daniel's shoulder, the motion shaky but reassuring. "They won't," he whispered, though the doubt gnawed at him. He glanced around the room at the mess of holiday cards, the old photos, and Daniel's crayon-smudged hands. He felt a strange, fierce determination rise within him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving for himself. He was holding on for someone else, too. That evening, after Daniel left, Mr. Harris sat by his window, the sky darkening into night. He felt the old loneliness clawing at him, but now it had an opponent, the small, bright spirit that Daniel had lit inside him. He knew that if he wanted to stay, if he wanted to keep that flicker alive, he would need to face the shadows he had long ignored. The icy grip of uncertainty loomed over them both, but for the first time, Mr. Harris felt the ember of fight within him, a reminder that life, no matter how fragile, was worth holding on to. Winter's hold tightened on the neighborhood, wrapping it in a shroud of snow and silence. Inside Mr. Harris's house, a small fire crackled in the hearth, painting the walls in wavering shades of orange and gold. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, focused on a puzzle while Mr. Harris watched, a rare smile tugging at his lips. For once, the weight in his chest felt lighter, a shadow pushed back by the boy's warmth. But the peace was fragile, shattered by the ringing of the doorbell. Mr. Harris's heart leapt to his throat. He exchanged a look with Daniel, whose wide eyes reflected the same sudden tension. With a heavy step, Mr. Harris opened the door to the same social worker from before, this time accompanied by a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard of her own. "Mr. Harris," she began, her tone clipped and professional, "we need to speak with you about the results of our visit last week." Daniel stood up, fists clenched at his sides. "He's fine. I told you, he's okay," he burst out, his small voice trembling with urgency. The social worker glanced down at the boy, sighing before looking back at Mr. Harris. "It's not just about okay, Daniel. Mr. Harris, we're here to discuss your safety and well-being. We've arranged for a temporary stay at a care facility so that you can be assessed and supported." The words were a blow, stealing the air from the room. Mr. Harris's vision blurred as a wave of helplessness washed over him. But Daniel stepped forward, eyes locked on the adults as if daring them to argue. "You can't take him away. He's my friend, and he's getting better," Daniel said, tears pooling but unspilled, his voice cracking under the strain. The woman softened, bending down to meet Daniel's eye level. "This isn't forever, sweetheart. It's just to make sure he's okay," she said, though her expression was more practiced than warm. "No," Daniel whispered, the defiance waning into a plea. He turned to Mr. Harris, his tiny hand grasping the old man's trembling fingers. "Please don't let them take you." Mr. Harris felt the old ache resurface, the same one that had gripped him when he lost Emily, when Thomas left and didn't return. But now, it was different. Now, someone was holding on to him, believing in him. He squeezed Daniel's hand, his voice cracking with desperation and resolve. "I won't go anywhere without a fight," he said, meeting the eyes of the officials with a look that hadn't been there in years. The woman exchanged a glance with the social worker, sensing the rising tension. "Mr. Harris, there's an alternative," she said slowly. "If a family member or a close friend can provide adequate support, this could be reevaluated." A silence fell. The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's gaze flitted to his mother's house, his mind racing. Without warning, he bolted out the door and across the snow-covered street, shouting for his mom. "Mama! Mama, please, you have to help!" Elena Rivera appeared at the door, concern etched into her features. She took in the sight of her son, breathless and urgent, then the officials standing by Mr. Harris, and she understood. Her heart sank but steadied as Daniel clutched her arm, pulling her toward the house. Inside, she faced the officials, her jaw set and eyes resolute. "We're his neighbors, and we've been helping him," she said firmly. "He's not alone. He's not forgotten. If support is what he needs, then he'll have it. From us." Mr. Harris's vision misted, not with fear, but with something warmer, something fierce. He looked at Elena, then at Daniel, who stood with a defiant gleam in his eyes. The social workers exchanged glances, the rigidity of protocol giving way to the humanness of the moment. "All right," the woman said after a pause. "We'll review this arrangement. For now, as long as Mr. Harris is cared for and supported, he can remain at home." The room breathed again, a collective sigh of relief washing over them. Daniel's smile returned, radiant and triumphant, as he wrapped his arms around Mr. Harris. The old man's heart swelled, the barriers around it splintering completely. This was more than a victory. It was proof that life, however broken, could still be patched together with the simplest yet strongest of threads: love and unwavering kindness. The days that followed were marked by quiet changes, small shifts that hinted at a new beginning. Elena visited Mr. Harris's house daily, bringing warm meals and gentle conversation. Daniel's laughter bounced off the walls, filling rooms that had long been silent. The old man found himself smiling more, the heaviness in his chest easing as the cold winter outside warred with the warmth blooming within. One evening, as the last light of the day cast long shadows through the window, Mr. Harris pulled out a dusty wooden box from the back of a closet. Daniel, who was working on a drawing at the table, looked up curiously. "Mr. Harris's fingers trembled as he lifted the lid, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small toy soldier carved from wood. He held it in his hand, the memories surging forward like a wave that threatened to pull him under. "This was Thomas's," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel's eyes widened as he approached, reverently peeking into the box as if it were a treasure chest. "Tell me about him," Daniel whispered, sensing the weight of the moment. "Mr. Harris's eyes glistened as he began to speak, the words spilling out cautiously, like a stream trickling over stone. He spoke of Thomas's boundless energy, how he would race his bike down the very street where Daniel now played. He spoke of the way Thomas used to whistle tunelessly while he built models at the kitchen table, his dark curls falling into his eyes. And finally, how the house, once full of laughter, had grown silent when the news came. News that his son would not be returning. The old man's voice cracked as he said, "I built this wall around me, Daniel, to keep the pain out, but I didn't realize it kept everything else out too." Daniel, wide-eyed and solemn, reached out to touch Mr. Harris's hand. "I'm glad you let me in," he said, the simplicity of his words cutting through the years of grief like sunlight through clouds. A knock at the door startled them both. Elena stood there, her coat wrapped tightly around her, eyes soft with concern. "I heard voices. Is everything all right?" Mr. Harris's smile was faint but real. "Yes, Elena, everything is all right." He gestured for her to join them, and for the first time, the kitchen felt full, bustling with warmth. They sat together, sharing stories and silences that didn't need to be filled. But the moment was interrupted by the ringing of the phone. Mr. Harris stiffened, unused to the sudden sound. He picked up the receiver, the tremor in his hand returning. The voice on the other end was familiar, but aged, deepened by years and distant. "Dad?" The voice was raw, a single word spoken with hesitation, disbelief and hope all tangled together. Mr. Harris's knees weakened, and Elena quickly moved to steady him. His voice, choked and barely above a whisper, replied, "Thomas?" Daniel's eyes widened, darting between the adults as the room spun with an electric tension. Elena's hand tightened on Mr. Harris's shoulder, grounding him as his eyes filled with tears that finally fell, unrestrained. "I found the letters, Dad. The ones Mom sent. "I'm coming home," Thomas said, the line buzzing softly as if the universe held its breath. The moment stretched, disbelief warring with joy. Mr. Harris, who had kept his grief so close for so long, let it unravel in a cascade of sobs. Daniel's small arms wrapped around him, holding tight as if he could anchor the old man to this new reality, where hope had found its way back to them. The kitchen, once a hollow shell of memories, thrummed with life. It was a place reborn, where sorrow and joy mixed like fire and ice, melting away years of silence. This was not just a return, it was a resurrection, a promise that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, love, and the courage to hold on. The days until Thomas's arrival were filled with an almost surreal anticipation. The neighborhood, once accustomed to Mr. Harris's solitary figure and curt nods, buzzed with life. Word of Thomas's impending return spread, weaving through conversations at the local grocery store and hushed talks on porches wrapped in scarves and jackets. Mr. Harris's house, previously worn and somber, now glowed with soft light from the windows and a wreath that Daniel had helped hang on the front door. Elena took charge of organizing the space, her hands moving with practiced ease as she dusted surfaces long forgotten and placed fresh flowers by the windowsill. Daniel, with sleeves rolled up, helped wherever he could, from sweeping to chatting away stories that made Mr. Harris chuckle. His laughter no longer a brittle sound, but something fuller, richer. One late afternoon, while Daniel helped trim the bushes outside, Mr. Harris sat in his armchair, the wooden toy soldier clutched in his hand. His mind was a storm of emotions, joy, guilt, hope, and fear, all warring for dominance. He looked out at Daniel, who glanced back and waved with an exuberant grin that reached his eyes. The sight anchored Mr. Harris, grounding him in the present. Suddenly, the distant hum of an engine interrupted the stillness. It grew louder, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Daniel froze, wide-eyed, as a dark sedan pulled up and stopped in front of the house. The car door opened, and out stepped Thomas, older and leaner than the boy in the photographs, his uniform creased, but his eyes unmistakably familiar. Mr. Harris stood, the room tilting around him as he leaned on his cane for support. Thomas's gaze locked onto his father's, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. The space between them was heavy with years lost, with words unsaid and memories that had aged in silence. "Dad?" Thomas said, the word breaking like a wave as he took a step forward. Mr. Harris's vision blurred, and he felt the warmth of Elena's supportive touch at his elbow. But he didn't need it. Strength surged through him as he stepped out onto the porch, each movement deliberate and full of purpose. His hand trembled as it reached out, and Thomas grasped it, pulling him into an embrace that spoke more than any words ever could. Tears coursed down their faces, mingling with the cold winter air, yet neither let go. Daniel, standing at the edge of the yard, watched the scene unfold with a smile that nearly split his face. He dashed forward and hugged them both, laughter bubbling up as Thomas tousled his hair. "I told you they couldn't take him away," Daniel said triumphantly, the memory of that day like a battle he had won. Mr. Harris let out a choked laugh, squeezing both Daniel and Thomas. "No, they couldn't," he said, his voice a blend of wonder and certainty. They couldn't. The three of them walked into the house together, the warmth spilling out into the cold street where neighbors paused to watch with smiles and glistening eyes. Inside, the living room was a riot of small, personal touches. Cards, crafts, and photographs newly displayed, each item a testament to the past weeks that had rekindled life in the old house. They sat around the kitchen table, the silence no longer awkward but peaceful, as Thomas began to share stories of where he had been, of long days that stretched into years, of letters lost but somehow found again. Mr. Harris listened, each word a balm to old wounds, while Daniel interjected with questions and wide-eyed wonder. The kitchen once again thrummed with life, no longer a room of ghosts, but of laughter, shared stories, and the promise of more to come. In the soft glow of the evening, Mr. Harris knew that this was what he had feared he would never have, a chance to hold on to love, stronger and brighter than before. The sun rose timidly over the quiet street, casting a warm golden hue that melted the lingering frost from the rooftops. Inside Mr. Harris's home, the soft hum of conversation and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the room. It was a morning unlike any other in years, one where Mr. Harris found himself standing by the kitchen window, watching Thomas and Daniel outside. Thomas, still in the simple clothes of homecoming, leaned down to show Daniel how to carve a small wooden bird from a block of pine. Their laughter mingled with the distant chirping of sparrows, a sound Mr. Harris had once taken for granted. The old man's eyes misted, not from sadness, but from a deep, swelling gratitude. The once hollow space inside him now brimmed with light and connection. He glanced at the table, where a photo of Emily smiled back at him, her gaze warm and eternal. He touched the frame lightly, as if sharing this moment with her. Elena entered, her hands dusted with flour. She paused beside Mr. Harris, following his gaze out the window. "It's nice, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft with contentment. Mr. Harris nodded, his eyes not leaving the sight of his son and the boy who had changed everything. "More than nice," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It's everything." Elena smiled, turning back to tend to the fresh bread cooling on the counter. The warmth in the kitchen was matched by the warmth in Mr. Harris's chest, a feeling he'd thought lost to time. He took a deep breath, savoring the mingled scents of wood and bread, and the steady murmur of voices that spoke of life continuing, fuller and richer than before. Outside, Daniel's voice called through the open window. "Mr. Harris, come and see what we made." He chuckled, the sound startling him with its freedom. "Coming," he called, stepping carefully onto the porch where the light of the morning met him like an embrace. His cane tapped softly on the wooden boards as he made his way down the steps, eyes alight with joy. Thomas looked up, eyes deep and familiar, now softened by the return home. In his hands, he held the small carved bird, wings spread as if caught mid-flight. He handed it to his father, their fingers brushing, a touch that conveyed all the unspoken words of forgiveness and love. "It's for you, Dad," Thomas said, his voice steady and full of warmth. "For all the times we'll still have." Daniel hopped excitedly around them, his laughter infectious. "It means hope," he added, looking at Mr. Harris with an expectant grin. Mr. Harris took the small wooden bird, tracing its smooth curves. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hope." As the morning sun stretched higher, neighbors passed by and waved, their smiles genuine, their steps a little lighter. The street, once a place of silence and whispers, now thrived with connection. Mr. Harris knew that while he could not reclaim the lost years, he could savor every new one, every shared moment and burst of laughter. The three of them, an old man reborn, a son returned, and a boy who had seen what others hadn't, stood together, surrounded by the quiet understanding that they were family now, not just by blood, but by the bonds of kindness, resilience, and the simple act of holding on when it mattered most. In that moment, beneath the clear winter sky, they knew that love and hope were not just memories to be held, but gifts to be shared, unfurling like wings ready for flight. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more tales of resilience, love, and the extraordinary power of human connection.